What is going on, everybody? Tyler Brandt back here with another video, and in today's video we are going to talk a little bit about the Patriots training camp. So far there's been about 3 days of practices where reporters have been allowed in and allowed to, make observations and get a part and get a look of what the Patriots are going to be in 2020. So I figure for this video, we'll break down a little bit of what we've seen from most of the positions on the football field, some of the good we've seen, and we're going to elect, there's one guy in particular who's been an absolute standout in training camp. We're also going to get into him a little bit. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So let's start with this camp review with the most important position on the football field. And of course, we are talking about the starting quarterback position. So there really hasn't been much leeway either way with any of the quarterbacks currently on the depth chart. Everybody's been getting reps at random times. There's no real order. Everybody's been getting virtually the same amount of reps. Nobody's really pulled out in front. In particular, of the two guys we're looking at, Stidham has thrown his fair share of interceptions. He's been a little wild with the ball, but Cam has also thrown some interceptions too. There's been a lot of good stuff on tape. There's been definitely some bad stuff on tape. I would say, reading everything I read, it seems like the defense has been the winners of camp early on. They've just been all over the place, picking off quarterbacks. I mean, they really have. And honestly, I think the most consistent, maybe not the flashiest or the best, but the most consistent guy through the first 3 days of camp have realistically been Brian Hoyer. I mean, he's been consistently, not turning the ball over at a decent rate. So I think early on, I don't think it means anything, but through the first 3 days of practice, Hoyer's been the most consistent, but Stidham and Cam Newton have both shown some real good flashes of things. And of course, Cam is just infectious with how he is on the practice field. I mean, he's got $1 million smile. He's always having fun. And from what I've read, that seems to spread around the locker room. And guys are having a good time, Cam and people are dancing on the field and just having fun, which is really good. And that's awesome. So quarterback battle still up in the air, really. One last note on Cam Newton before we move on. I will say also that he overthrew Damiere Byrd. He overthrew Damiere Byrd on pretty much like a go route. And while it was a pretty bad overthrow, he overthrew him by like 30 yards from my understanding. It was nice to see that the shoulder that was one of the questions with him and his health going into the season. His shoulder looks good. He can rip the ball. He can get it down the field. So a promising big miss by Cam in terms of the ball itself, but very promising that he could still absolutely launch the ball. Let's now quickly brush up on the running backs. Sony Michel and Lamar Miller both haven't practiced yet, which isn't too much of a surprise considering they're both still rehabbing. The two guys that have really gotten the biggest looks have been, of course, Rex Burkhead, who's looked pretty good, and Damian Harris, who has also been, for a couple days and for a couple opportunities, been used as a feature back. Really nothing bad about either guy. Both of them have looked pretty good. So those have been the guys getting the bulk of the running back work in terms of, through the tackles running and the running game and the running offense for New England. So, again, who knows what they'll be used for, especially with Lamar Miller and Sony Michel back. But in terms of the first 3 days of camp, those are your two running backs. On to the wide receivers we go, and it's been, some good, some bad. There's been a few drops. Gunnar Olszewski has had a couple drops. Mohamed Sanu has had a couple drops. But more on the good stuff. It's been a very impressive camp from top to bottom so far for most of this wide receiver group. We'll start, of course, with Mohamed Sanu. He has had a couple drops, but his footwork and his route running, people said, have greatly improved, and he's really sticking out like that. Next up on the list, we'll go to Gunnar Olszewski, who has really had a fantastic week. He's been on the field as a returner in the return game and the special teams game. He made a catch on Gilmore. We'll get into the significance of that a little bit later when we talk about the defensive backs. But he had a catch today on Wednesday, I believe, against Stephen Gilmore. And he's really looked pretty good. So he's been one of the question marks coming in, and he's gotten better. And he's really sticking out so far in training camp. Damiere Byrd has also looked pretty good. He blew past Jason McCourty and beat him for about a 30-yard touchdown. Further down the list, Devin Ross has really looked good. He's made a few nice plays. He also torched Juwan Williams, the second-round pick from last year, who looks like he's maybe struggling a little bit. That second-round curse for Belichick and cornerbacks maybe. But Devin Ross blew right by him for, I believe, a 50-yard touchdown. One thing, I know we talked about him, he's been mentioned on the channel a few times, is Jeff Thomas, the wide receiver from Miami. He is yet to practice, which is unfortunate for UDFA. That's not good. I'm hoping for whatever reason he's not practicing, he gets back on the field as soon as possible. And let's group the tight ends with this. Although the tight end group hasn't done much outside of Asiasi and Dalton Keene. Keene has been working, of course, with the tight ends, but he's also been working with the running backs group, so I think that's pretty intriguing. And Devin Asiasi has also looked just about as good as advertised, especially as a pass catcher, but also he was complimented and he really stood out as a blocker. So just some couple notes from the tight end group. Another note on the wide receiver group before we move on. N'Keal Harry has also looked pretty good. He looks slimmer and more lean than he did coming into camp in his rookie year last season. So overall, the wide receiver group has impressed. They have a lot of work to do coming from where they were last season, but both the wide receivers and the tight ends do look promising. Moving right along, the next up on the list is the offensive lineman. Not much to report here. David Andrews is back. The offensive line looks good. The real question here is the right tackle spot, and it looks like Jermaine Eluemunor has been the guy getting most of the right tackle snaps. What that means for Yodny Kajust, what that means for Corey Cunningham, who knows? But the guy, at least for the first 3 days, that has been getting most of the snaps is Eluemunor. Now, let's get to the defensive side of the ball. The linebackers, not too much to report here. They've looked pretty good. Juwan Bentley's looked about as good as advertised. Anthony Jennings, the third-round pick from Alabama, he hasn't practiced at all yet for reasons undisclosed, but he has yet to practice. Moving down the list, Josh Uche he's pretty much been the busiest linebacker so far in camp. He's been doing stuff in the passing game. He's done some rush the passer work. Not that they're really full on coming at the quarterback, but he's definitely been busy. He's been all over the field. And finally, on the linebacker front, Cash Malua intercepted Cam Newton recently in practice. Again, what does it mean? No, who knows? I don't want to say it means really much of anything, but Cam didn't really see him, and it was a nice ball, and he just picked it off. So a lot of good momentum for the young man. And the linebacking core, although we haven't really gotten to see them too much, they do look pretty good. One of the final big groups I want to talk about, I'm going to lump them in as one big lump sum, and that is all the defensive backs, the safeties, and the cornerbacks. Let's start first with Gilmore. I mean, we know how good he was last season. It looks like he hasn't lost a step. He's only given up one reception so far through 3 days of camp. That was to Gunnar Olszewski. So he's only given up one reception, excuse me. He's been all over the ball. He's had a couple pass breakups. He's had an interception. He's been very good. J.C. Jackson also has an interception at camp. He's also, again, looked good, standing out. Terrence Brooks, the safety, has gotten in the way of a ball, has had a pass breakup, also looked good in terms of guys that have stood out. And finally, without further ado, the standout of camp, the guy that has looked the best, and which is probably the most promising for him and for this defense, and that is Kyle Dugger. Now, we've talked about Kyle Dugger on this channel a few times, whether he can get into that next level and play and get up to game speed fast. Now, there's no preseason. He's not going to get any real NFL action, but in terms of playing with big leaguers and NFL talent, he's looked fantastic. He's picked off Cam Newton. He's picked off Jarrett Stidham. He's had pass breakups. He's been all over the ball. He stood up. He stood out. He stood up, and he's really taken an opportunity to be the starting safety next to Devin McCourty. It looks like if this is what he's going to do, that's exactly what he'll be doing. And he's just been very, very good. He's been as good as advertised, and it's been very, very promising for New England. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the special teams. First, let's talk about the kick punt returning, and that has been primarily done by J.J. Taylor, by Gunnar Olszewski, by Isaiah Zuber, by Kyle Dugger. They've been the primary return guys so far in camp. They've all looked pretty good doing it. For guys like maybe Devin Ross, Jeff Thomas, guys like that, if they're not out there returning kicks and returning punts, that may be their team, their way to stay on the team. And by missing those snaps, it's really hurting them. But other guys like J.J. Taylor, Isaiah Zuber, for example, they both look good. If they can both make the team as return specialists, good for them. And, you know, they're making the most of their snaps. So next up, let's talk Jake Bailey, the punter who joined New England in 2019. He's looked very, very good. On Tuesday in practice, I believe, he downed 4 or 5 punts in a row at the 1 yard line. He was excellent in 2019, looking to pick up right where he left off in 2020. Finally, let's talk Justin Rohrwasser. Now, he's in live drills 3 for 5 kicking Every kick has been north of 40 to 50 yards. So they've all been long field goals, but 3 for 5 isn't a place you want to get too comfortable in. You'd like to see him at least go 4 for 5, 5 for 5 perfectly, but this one is going to be tough because I don't know how you get experience when you're not kicking in a real NFL atmosphere. There's no way to simulate that in practice, and I wonder if he'll have a long leash come 2020 in the regular season, I mean. So I'm not really sure what the future holds for someone like him. I'm hoping, he straightens it out and, he goes into the regular season as the guy. But with, Gostkowski there and not on a team, maybe he is, maybe he comes back very early on and, Rohrwasser's leash is short. We'll see. 3 for 5 isn't great, so it's very shaky early on for the kicking situation. But that is going to do it for this video on the first 3 days of training camp in New England. Kind of the standouts, the good, a little bit of the bad, what's going on. They've been making some transactions. I know they signed a few young tight ends. They signed an offensive lineman from Michigan to come in. It'll be very intriguing to see if these are just practice squad guys, if they, make a wave in camp and make the team. But these, like we said in a previous video, this is pretty much what your 2020 New England Patriots are going to look like. I think Duggar, early on, looking this good is excellent. It's very promising. The secondary, I expect, will be probably better than it already is, and it's already the best secondary in football. So I think that's very promising. The one thing that does scare me, at least through 3 days, is are the quarterbacks this inconsistent, all of them? Are they all this inconsistent because they're throwing against an elite secondary? Or is quarterback production going to be something that is going to plague New England all 2020? And I'll tell you, if the quarterback position does plague New England all season, it really could be a very, very different year in New England. But there's a lot more camp left. I think they're going to probably start getting into real game situations and stuff like that as practices go on. And again, most of this is with a grain of salt. Again, it's just training camp. But without preseason, this is what we have to go on. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. Once again, I am Tyler Brandt. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, I appreciate every single one of you that subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at the Tyler Brandt, on Instagram at Talking Pats. And until next time, be safe, be good, and I'll catch you on the next video.